Good afternoon, folks.
Afternoon.
And as always, greetings to you folks who may listen to this later on DVD. Let me get my watch, make sure. Speak long enough.
Let's keep this short.
Okay. Out there in the religious community of the world, we see a lot of so-called ministers teaching their congregations and preaching on TV that all you have to do is just come to Christ, accept Him as Christ. That's all there is to do. You don't have to, there's no adherence to any of the commandments found in the Bible. None of those are required. Just believe in Christ, and that's all there is to it. They preach freedom to these people, freedom from the laws and commandments of God. And yet, unlike the Pharisees, on the other hand, they will place a whole host of man-made rules and regulations upon their ministers. They want to do away with God's laws and place a whole host of their own regulations upon their members. You must do this and you must do that in order to have real faith and become a pious Christian in the eyes of the Creator. Well, Jesus, speaking of the Pharisees in Matthew 23, verse 4, says, "For they bind heavy burdens, grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." And this is the way of most organized religion today. They do the same thing that the Pharisees did. If you've been in the church for any length of time, as many of you hear this has been, you've heard many, many sermons on faith. Some good, some bad. In my 40-plus years in the church, I've heard so many I couldn't count them, I guess. Probably you have too. And after listening to a lot of those old ministers explain how difficult it is to acquire faith and all the things you must do to obtain, maintain faith, many people become victims of tyranny. They become victims of the pressure and frustration brought on by the never-ending demands of organized religion. Many of these so-called preachers, as I said, they preach freedom to their listeners, but like the Pharisees, they will strive to bring their listeners under their control by all these rules and regulations. And this is nothing more than tyranny. This kind of tyranny is intensified, for as we know, nothing in this world today seems to be simple. It seems everything has gotten so complicated in this world, including a life of faith as taught by most churches. Instead of having a simple and meaningful relationship with God, it seems the Christian life has evolved into off-the-graph expectations and borderline madness, if you will. It has evolved into a religion and faith based upon unrealistic and delusive expectations, and it becomes anything but simple. It would seem the complications of life in general, they have bled over into our relationship with Christ and messed everything up. If you were to ask the average believer out there in the religious community a simple question like, what does it mean to be a mature Christian? What kind of answer would you get from that person? Well, for starters, they would probably tell you you needed to be at church as often as possible. And that's true, you should. But that you'd need to be at church as often as possible, to witness regularly, teach a Sunday school class, make hospital visits, pray fervently, write uplifting notes to the discouraged, memorize Scripture, and tithe regularly. They might include adding, that you need to attend a Christian seminar once or twice a year, Go to the church's family camp every year. Support and attend week-long evangelistic crusades. Send your children to Christian schools. Participate in the church boards and committees. Serve in the nursery. Serve in the church kitchen and the neighborhood visitation outreach program, the choir, summer missions projects, and the Right to Life campaign. In addition, if you are a really mature Christian, you can find no place in your life for discouragement, no room for doubt, and no time for just plain fun. For these people, faith is intense stuff. It's a real merry-go-round. That's probably what you would get from those people. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with doing some of these things in your Christian life. And some of these things may help you to grow in faith. But if we think we have to be involved in all of these things and make our life miserable and complicated to become a mature Christian, then we have drifted from what Christ's original teachings were on the simplicity of faith. We have turned our relationship and walk with God into a ruthless obstacle course and an exhausting marathon if we think we have to do all those things. We have added enormous weights to our own feet and the feet of others in this race that we're going down. And the result is many people are opting not to enter the race at all. And who could blame them? You know, who needs extra baggage when your life is already too heavy as it is? Why do you need extra baggage? And I'll tell you a little funny story to place some emphasis on this. Seems there was this man at the Dallas International Airport, and he was worried about missing his plane. And he had no wristwatch, and he couldn't find or locate a clock anywhere. So he ran up to a total stranger and said, "Excuse me, could you give me the time, please?" The stranger smiled and said, "Sure." So he sat down his two large suitcases he was carrying, and he looked at the watch on his wrist. He said, "It's exactly 5:09. The temperature outside is 75 degrees, and it's supposed to rain tonight. In London, the sky is clear, and the temperature is 38 degrees Celsius. The barometer reading is 29.14 and falling. And let's see, in Singapore, the sun is shining brightly. And oh, by the way, the moon should be full here in Dallas tonight." "Your watch tells you all that?" the man interrupted. "Oh, yes," said the stranger, "and much, much more. You see, I invented this watch, and I can assure you there is no other timepiece like it in the world." "I want to buy that watch," the man said. "I'll pay you $2,000 right now." No, said the stranger. "It's not for sale," as he reached down to pick up his two large suitcases. "Wait, $4,000, the man said. "I'll pay $4,000 in cash," reaching for his wallet. "No, I can't sell it," said the man. "You see, I plan to give it to my son for his 21st birthday. I invented it for him to enjoy." "Okay, listen," the man said. "I'll give you $10,000. I've got the money right here." So the stranger paused, he thought a minute, and he said, $10,000? He said, "You'll give me $10,000 for this watch?" "Okay, it's yours for $10,000 even." The man was absolutely elated. He paid the stranger, he took the watch, and he snapped it on his wrist with glee and said thanks as he turned to leave. Wait, said the stranger. With a big smile, he handed him the two heavy suitcases to the man and added, "Don't forget the batteries." So, you know, a lot of times we have a lot of extra baggage, don't we? That's exactly what it's like when organized religion tells folks about the things Christ has to offer. They speak of one pleasure after another. They speak of this blessing and that blessing, and this benefit and that benefit. They speak about sins being forgiven, about peace within and joy without, strength amidst trials and hope beyond the grave. And there's certainly nothing wrong with all these things. Who wouldn't want all these things? But what they don't tell them is all the unexpected extra baggage that will be required of them. And in time, that added weight will turn a life of simple faith into a life of oppression by the tyranny of some ministers in the field of organized religion, by requiring this urgency from its members. But what if being close to God were simple? What if this thing called faith is as complicated as organized religion makes it out to be? Would what if you could be liberated? I mean, really set free from all those expectations that organized religion and even a few of our own so-called good, intense friends have laid upon us. What if I could show you how to get rid of all the excess baggage so you could return to a life that doesn't require running double time or maintaining a super spiritual standard based on a hectic schedule when it comes to your faith? Would you be interested in that? Probably so. But you'd probably be suspicious too, wouldn't you? Before I finish, you would be looking for 2 heavy suitcases as part of the deal. Well, you would be wrong. For a life of faith and obedience to God was never meant to be complicated. It really wasn't. God's liberating grace brings us hope beyond the bonds of man-made legalism. Now, it's true. God demands of us obedience to His laws. And there are things we must do to be a true Christian. But He has freed us from all these bonds of man-made legalism. And believe me, this Pharisaical attitude and ways of doing things still exist today among many churches, even as it did back then, even in some of the churches of our own traditions, I'm sad to say. Those of us who have been around for a while and has lived through some of this. So let's look at some of Christ's words of simple faith to help us live beyond the harassment of all these man-made expectations that are required, that some churches require of their members. And as we look at some of the things He said, we can begin to see, that a Christian life is not based on some high-level performance to the expectations of some minister or the church. It is based on quiet faithfulness, not on impressive works, but on deep relationships. God came to our rescue while we were trapped in a dark dungeon, so to speak, a dark dungeon of despair brought on by Satan the devil. He has made it possible for us to have what we do not deserve and cannot earn. He has freed us by making it possible for our sins to be forgiven. And that, veil of eternal death from hanging over us. Jesus tells us in Luke 4:18 that He was sent to heal the brokenhearted and to preach deliverance to the captives. And He was speaking here of something far deeper than just setting someone free from physical incarceration. He was speaking of us being delivered from the captivity of this world and Satan the devil. That's His purpose for coming, and the things He did and the death He died. That's what it was for. And remember, Christ, who came to set the captives free, still offers a life worth living to those who have been liberated. It's not a life that's always easy and comfortable, but neither is it all that complicated. Jesus tells us in Matthew 11:28-30, if you want to jot that down, He says, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So we shall discover from Jesus' own words spoken on a mountain or a mount in the first century, probably more like a hillside in the first century, a Christian's life should be a life of simple faith, not something complicated. Now, when it came to clear communication, there was none better than Jesus. He was the master of communication. Children and adults alike had no difficulty understanding his words or following his reasoning, except maybe when he's spoken parables. For he says, that he's spoken parables so that people wouldn't understand. But for a lot of his teachings, they could follow his reasoning and his understanding. And this is remarkable because while he was on earth, he lived in a society that had become accustomed to clique-ridden religious double talk. We see a lot of that today as well. The scribes, the priests, and the Pharisees who dominated the synagogue in Palestine saw to that. However, they unintentionally made Jesus' simple style and straightforward approach seem all the more refreshing to the people. When he spoke, people listened. Unlike the so-called pious professionals of his day, Jesus' words made sense to the people. And this was never truer than when he sat down on a hillside with a group of his followers and talked about what really mattered in the Christian life. This short speech is what we call today the Sermon on the Mount. His words were authoritative, but not officious. They were insightful, but not sermonic. His hillside chat was an informal, reasonable, thoughtful, and unpretentious presentation. And in his speech, he distills an enormous amount of truth in an incredibly brief, short period of time. And to those who had endured a lifetime of boring, irrelevant sermons, sat spellbound to the very end of his sermon. It wasn't actually a sermon. He was sitting down talking to the people. And the result was the multitudes were amazed at his teachings, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes, it tells us. And that's in Matthew 7, 28 and 29, at the very last of his sermon. Now, first of all, we need to understand the background behind that statement, that he spoke to them as one having authority, not as the scribes. For if we do not understand the background to that statement, we will not appreciate the depth of his listeners' gratitude. In short, those people were fed up with the manipulation, the pride, and the hypocrisy of their religious leaders of the day. Long years of legalism mixed with the Pharisaic power plays designed to intimidate and control held the general public in bondage. And it's sad to say, again, this even happens among God's own people from time to time. I personally have been associated, and maybe you have too, with groups where this has happened. However, man-made systems of complicated requirements and back-breaking demands shut the people behind invisible bars, and that shackles them in chains of guilt. Those people could not measure up, and many were losing heart, as we have seen many in the past do ourselves. Then out of the blue came Jesus with his message of liberating grace, encouragement to the weary, and hope for the sinful person. Best of all, everything he said was based on truth, God's truth, instead of rigid religious regulations. Now, he in no wise nullified the laws and commandments of God. It was all of those man-made regulations which were laid upon the believers. It was all of those things which organized religion demands of its members. He talked of faith, simple faith, in terms that anyone should be able to understand. His authenticity caught them off guard, and it disarmed their suspicions, and it blew away the fog that surrounded organized religion, which had surrounded organized religion for decades. So it's no wonder the people found him amazing to listen to. It's no wonder the scribes and the Pharisees found him unbearable to listen to. For hypocrisy despises truth along with authenticity. And they were a bunch of hypocrites. Jesus calls them that. When truth reveals wrongdoing, those who are exposed get very nervous. And I'm afraid there's going to be some people get very nervous in our political process before too long. Reminds me of another story. You may have heard this story as well. But it seems there were two brothers who were exceedingly rich. They were also wicked to the core. Both lived a wild, unprofitable existence, and they used their wealth to cover up the dark side of their lives. You may have seen people like that yourself. On the surface, however, no one would have suspected what they really were. These cover-up artists, they attended the same church every Sunday and contributed large sums of money to various church-related projects. Then the church called in a new pastor. He was a young man who preached the truth with zeal and courage. Before long, he had an attendance. The attendance had grown so much that the church needed a larger place to worship, larger worship center. Being a man of keen insight and strong integrity, this young pastor had also seen the hypocritical lifestyles of these two brothers. He saw through them. Well, suddenly, one of the brothers died, and the young pastor was asked to preach his funeral. The day before the funeral, the surviving brother pulled the minister aside and handed him a large envelope. There's a check in here that's large enough to pay for the entire amount you need for the new sanctuary, the surviving brother said. All I ask is one favor. Tell the people at the funeral that he was a saint. Well, the minister gave the brother his word. He would do precisely what was asked. That afternoon, he deposited the check into the church's bank account. The next day, the young pastor stood before the casket at the funeral service and said with firm conviction, "This man was an ungodly sinner, wicked to the core. He was unfaithful to his wife. He was hot-tempered with his children, ruthless in business, and a hypocrite at church. But in comparison to his brother, he was a saint." Oh, okay. So, the boldness of authenticity is something beautiful to behold. Unless, of course, you happen to be a hypocrite. That explains why Jesus' words, which brought, such comfort to those who followed him, it enraged the Pharisees because they were hypocrites. And although he never called one of them by name on this hillside speech here, he exposed their legalistic lifestyle as no one had ever done before. And they knew what he was talking about. On the surface, Jesus' words, which are recorded in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount as it's called, Jesus' words may seem calm in tone and basic in their simplicity, and at first glance, they may appear to be nothing more than a gentle tap on the shoulder. But to the Pharisees, and even organized religion today, those who twist religion into a performance-oriented list of demands and expectations, they are nothing short of a bold discredit to those people. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai centuries earlier, he did not bring 10 suggestions with him. Likewise, when Jesus delivered his message from the Mount, it was no humble talk about morality. To the legalist, his words represented a howling reproach that continues on down to this down in this modern age. Jesus' words may have been simple, but they were definitely not dull or boring. Behind Jesus' teaching on the Palestine hillside that day was a deep concern for those who had surrendered their lives to the tyranny, of the pressure that was light years away from the simple truth or simple faith that Jesus taught. It seems that he was concerned with the possibility that some had gotten stuck into this Pharisaic model of substituting the artificial for the authentic, which is a danger that always lurks in the shadows of legalism. That's what the Pharisees were doing. They were teaching you were saved by works, not grace. And it wasn't even the works of God or the commandments of God. It was their own man-made works, their own made-up legalism, which they taught that men must do to be saved. And this kind of thinking, believe it or not, has worked its way right down in organized religion today. Look at the Catholic Church. It's my personal belief that the major message of what Jesus taught that day on that hillside can be enshrined in 5 little words that he spoke. And that's in chapter 6:8 here in Matthew. And those words are, do not be like them. He's telling his listeners and us not to be like them. It would seem Christ wants his followers, true followers, to be distinct, unlike the majority who follow the herd. Now, out on the farm, there's one distinct cow in the herd. And everywhere that lead cow goes, the rest will follow. If she tears down the fence and gets on the neighbor's property, they all go. They all get out. Wherever that dominant animal goes, the rest of the herd will follow. And Christ says we're not to do that. God doesn't want us solving conflicts, doing business, and responding to difficulties like everyone else in the world. God's people are not to maintain the same attitudes or choosing the same priorities of the majority. And for certain, we are not to emulate the ways of the Pharisees. And that's what you do if you do that. When Jesus says, do not be like them, he really means it. He hates hypocrisy, and he loves authenticity. Hypocrisy allows us to travel on both sides of the road. It allows us to look righteous, but yet to be unholy. It allows us to sound pious, but to secretly be profane. And those who get trapped in this hypocrisy syndrome always seem to find ways to hide their hypocrisy, just like the story of the 2 brothers. And the Pharisees, they were master at such things. That is why they created all those man-made requirements and expectations which they laid upon their followers. And it's the same today. Now, I'm taking someone else's word for this, for it would have taken an intense study to know for sure. But it's been said that the Pharisees tacked on 365 prohibitions to the Mosaic Law. What was written. Jesus says, always talking about what was written. Well, they added that to what was written in the Mosaic Law. And 250 additional commandments. They added that to the original law. But did it make them righteous? Well, hardly. Jesus told his listeners in his speech on the Mount, and us also, chapter 5:20 here in Matthew, he said, for I say unto you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. So we see a busier schedule mixed with a longer to-do list does not equal greater righteousness any more than driving fast leads to a calmer spirit. Now think on that one for a while. On the contrary, when we attempt to do more things or more physical works in seeking our salvation, we do nothing but complicate our Christian life. That's all we do. This was true in the time of Christ, and it still holds true today among organized religion. And, as I mentioned, sometimes even in our own ranks. Can you imagine the shock on the faces of the Pharisees when they heard that Jesus was telling his followers that their righteousness must exceed what they, the Pharisees themselves, had put forth? In fact, if we do a quick review of Jesus' message here on the Mount, we find him simplifying the walk of faith with 4 basic teachings, all of which are diametrically opposed to the Pharisaic lifestyle in today of organized religion. First of all, he says, out with hypocrisy, of which we have been talking about. And as we read through the 48 verses, in the 5th chapter of Matthew, it shows us Jesus is answering 3 questions here. Number 1, what does it mean to have character? That's in verse 3 through 12. In the 5th chapter of Matthew there. Number 2, what does it mean to make a difference? That's in verses 13 through 16. And I'm not going to read all that. I'm just telling you so you can jot them down and read them later. And the 3rd, what does it mean to be godly? He addresses that in verses 17 through 48. And in the 3rd section, verses 17 through 48 here, he repeats the same question no fewer than 6 times. He says, you have heard, but I say unto you. That's in verses 21 through 22. You have heard, but I say unto you again. That's in verses 27 28. It was said, but I say unto you. Verses 31 through 32. You have heard, but I say unto you. Verses 33 and 34 again. You have heard, but I say unto you. He repeats it again in verses 38 and 39. He says, you have heard, but I say unto you. He repeats it again there, verses 43 and 44. What was Jesus getting at by repeating these phrases? He is reminding the people of what they have heard for years, but what they have, he's reminding them what they have been taught and embellished by their religious leaders. Then he readdresses those same matters with an authentic with an authentic life in view. And what kind of life was that? It was a life free of hypocrisy that their teachers had. Jesus desires that his followers be people of simple faith, modeled in grace, and based on the truth of God and his laws and his commandments. Not in a bunch of man-made laws. Not the made-up commandments of man. Nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else. Oh, it's easy to fake true Christianity. It's easy to put forth a pious image that looks godly, but is in fact phony. There's people out there in the religious community and in the community of organized religion, all these so-called sanctimonious preachers on TV, breaking their necks to show you just how righteous they are. There are so many people trying so hard, but are they really righteous? Many of them are intense in what they do, but far from being spiritual. One good piece of advice is, be who you is, because if you is who you ain't who you is. So remember that one. Okay, if the early part of Jesus' teaching is saying out with hypocrisy, the next section recorded in Matthew chapter 6, is saying, down with performance. Now, there's nothing wrong with the right kind of performance. Don't misunderstand me. For God expects us to perform in the right areas if we are capable. What Jesus is saying here in his Sermon on the Mount is to quit placing so much attention on looking good before everyone else. Quit trying to make others think you're so pious, especially beneath, the front or the veneer. Because beneath that front and that veneer, a lot of times, are hidden wickedness, impure motives, and shameful deeds. So quit trying to hide all of that. We should leave showtime to the people in Hollywood. Jesus puts it straightforward. Beware of practicing before men to be seen of men or to be noticed of other people. That's in Matthew 6, verse 1. In other words, stop acting one way before others, knowing you are really not that way at all. Then he offers 3 practical examples of this. Number 1 is in giving. He says, when you therefore give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. When you give money, your tithes and offerings to the church, then don't make it a point to let everyone else know how much you're giving. Today, we don't blow trumpets, at least not literally, but there are some who give sizable contributions who would like to see their names cast in bronze, so to speak. They like it to be known by the public and the church, everyone in the church, and remembered forever that they were the ones who financed a certain project. They want everyone to know they were the heavy givers, that they were the high donors. A little fanfare, please. That's what they want. However, in contrast, when it comes to giving, Jesus emphasized, to be quiet about it. He said, no more hype. When we live by simple faith, big-time performances that bring us glory are out of place as a true Christian. When we choose a life of simple faith, we will keep our giving habits quiet, as instructed by Jesus. Now, Matthew 6, 3 and 4, it says, Jesus says, when you do alms, let not your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your alms may be in secret, and your Father which sees in secret shall reward you openly. Then he goes right on into the second thing we should do, different than the hypocrites, which is praying, is the next subject he addresses here. So what is our purpose of praying? He tells us in verse 5 through 7 here, and when you pray, you are not to be as the hypocrites, for they love to stand praying in the synagogues and on the street corners in order to be seen of men. Truly I say unto you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you pray, go to your inner room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. And when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetitions, as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. You hear some of these preachers on TV. They use some of the most eloquent words you ever heard while praying. But eloquent words will not get God's attention any more than a simple, heartfelt prayer will. I wonder sometimes whatever happened to the simplicity while praying. What has happened to uncluttered honesty when you're talking to God? Like the prayer of a child or the prayer of a humble farmer needing rain for his crops. Or maybe a homeless mother who has 2 hungry kids. Jesus is telling us to do away with performance-oriented praying. It is simple-hearted petitions from humble-minded people who come to him in humble-minded repentance, which he honors. Not some eloquent prayer. Number 3, he addresses fasting here. Now that's on down to verse 16 through 18. But he says fasting the way it should be done. He gives us he's talking about fasting the way it should be done as compared to the way the hypocrites do it. Chapter 6 here, verses 16 and 18. He tells us when you fast, do not put on a gloomy face, as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance in order to be seen or fasting by men. Truly I say unto you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you may not be seen of men or appear before men as to be fasting, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. Now, we read these words of Jesus, and we see that he has shot this "look at me because I'm so spiritual" syndrome full of holes when we read these words, for they are simple. Fasting is fine. In fact, it's commendable. But if we fast, pray, or give money to be seen, then forget it, folks. Forget it. These disciplines were never meant to be displays of the flesh. We don't do them to get a grade from someone else or some superficial, impression we can make. Again, we need to leave the acting to those people in Hollywood. So, be who you is and keep things simple. Out with the hypocrisy and down with the showmanship and up with tolerance, which is what Jesus addresses in verse 1 through 5 of chapter 7 here in his Sermon on the Mount. He goes on to say, "Do not judge lest you be judged. For in the way you judged, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Here we see Jesus continuing his passionate, howling reproach against hypocrisy. But do we take him seriously as to what he said? Not nearly enough, I'm afraid. There's lots of Christians who have become speck specialists. We look for specks. We try to detect specks and criticize those specks in other people, all the while deliberately ignoring the much larger and more offensive things in our own lives that could use some immediate attention. We need to be tolerant. That is, to a certain degree. We need to be tolerant of younger people if we are older. And those who are younger need to be tolerant and a little more respectful to the older. And those people who can read Hebrew and Greek need to be tolerated of those of us who can't. There is certainly nothing wrong with understanding those languages, and at times they can be helpful. But they can also be misused and abused. People who don't know the original language of Scripture can be taken advantage of by those who do. I've seen this. Some of you probably have too. Jesus' words penetrated the minds of his audience on that day. And they are recorded that they might penetrate our minds also. How much time have I got? I'll tell you another little story here about the misuse and abuse. of language. There was this notorious bandit, Mexican bandit named Jose Rodriguez. And he'd slip, and he lived on the Mexican-Texican border. And he'd sneak across the border, and he'd rob those Texas banks, and he was robbing them blind. And he'd sneak back across the border, and they couldn't catch him at all. So they finally got their best Texas Ranger on the job. And sure enough, he caught up with old Jose in a little dry, dusty town in Mexico. He looked through the door, and there was Jose standing at the bar drinking. Excuse me. So he pulled his guns, kicked the door open, and went in and said, "All right, Jose, I know who you are, and I know that you've stolen all the money, and I want it right now." And about that time, a little fella from the corner came up to the ranger and said, "Jose doesn't understand English." Said, "I'll have to interpret it to him." The ranger said, "Well, you tell him exactly what I said." So the little guy, in Spanish, of course, told Jose all that the ranger had said. The whole Jose, of course, he was speaking in Spanish too, said, "Well, tell him I guess he's got me for sure this time. Tell him to go down to the end of the street. There's a well down there." He said, four blocks down, 4 layers down, there's a rock there, a loose rock. And said, "I've stashed all that money behind that loose rock." Little guy shook his head and turned around to the ranger and said, "Jose said he wasn't telling you nothing about where the money at. Just go ahead and shoot." So he was going to get rid of Jose there and get the money. So, you know, language can be misused and abused, and I've seen people do that today. But when our faith is a genuine faith, a simple expression of our walk with God, tolerance, speaking of tolerance here, becomes more easily. Now, a word of caution, because this in no wise nullifies commitment. Jesus also says we are to know people by their fruits. We're to have tolerance, but you're also to know people by their fruits. He goes on to say in verse 6 and 7, verses 13 and 15, if you want to jot that down, here in chapter 7, that we are not to give what is holy to the dogs, and are not to throw our pearls before swines, lest they trample them under their feet and turn to tear you in pieces. He also says, "Ask, and it shall be given to you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be open unto you." Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is broad and leads to destruction, and many are those who enter by it. He says, "Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." And again, he was directing this at the Pharisees. So as Jesus brings his speech to an end there on the hillside that day, he tells the story of 2 houses. One built on a rock and the other built on sand. And with this, he wraps up his words with one major statement. People of simple faith mean what they say, and they do what they hear in accordance with the commandments of God. Unfortunately, most people today neither mean what they say or listen to what they hear, listen to the truth. Most people want to substitute words for actions and discussions and argument instead of personal involvement. Again, Jesus' words that day were penetrating. He warned them, and he's warning us also, because it's been preserved for us, that anyone who hears his sayings or heard those sayings that day and refused to do them was like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. When the rains descended and the floods came and the winds blew and beat upon the house, it fell. And great was the fall of it. However, those who listened and did what he said, that's back up in verses 24 and 25 of chapter 7 there, would be like a man building his house upon a rock. And when the storm came, it stood and it would not fall. And then in the last two verses 28 and 29, it tells us when Jesus ended his sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrines, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Those people sat there spellbound at his teachings, for they were simple and easy to understand, unlike all those man-made laws of the Pharisees and of organized religion today. They sat there in awe at the simplicity of his words. Do they have the same effect on us today? I certainly hope so.